Sean Baker, Damien Chazelle, Bennett Miller, the Safdie brothers, S. Craig Zoller, Robert Eggers, Jeff Nichols, Barry Jenkins, Sean Durkin, Ari Aster, Ryan Johnson, Jeremy Saulnier, David Lowery, Trey Edward Schultz, David Robert Mitchell. I just named a bunch of directors that will be familiar to any self-respecting cinephile. They are all directors with singular visions who have made exceptional films. But if you walked up to a random middle-aged person in the street and listed these directors, how likely is it that this total stranger will recognize any of these names? Not very likely. This person will no doubt be familiar with, say, Steven Spielberg, Martin Scorsese, Quentin Tarantino, the Coen brothers, Spike Lee, and probably even David Fincher. These directors are household names. They have penetrated the culture in such a way that it would be hard for them not to have recognition to your average moviegoer over the age of 30. The movie director has always been an enigmatic figure. Overseeing and deciding on all the elements that make up a motion picture is an important job, arguably the most important one on a movie set. So it makes sense for directors to have a prominent face in the culture. This is how it used to be. Back in the 70s, when studios had been transferred from the individualistic hands of moguls who were capable tastemakers and into the boardrooms of corporations who were clueless about how to make movies, they turned to young filmmakers to solve their problems. There had been famous American directors before, such as Alfred Hitchcock, Howard Hawks, John Ford, Orson Welles, Billy Wilder, and John Huston. But, with the exception of Hitchcock and Welles, their personal visions took a backseat to the needs of the genre and the studio. The new crop of 70s directors, which included George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, Francis Coppola, Peter Bogdanovich, Brian De Palma, Hal Ashby, William Friedkin, Martin Scorsese, Robert Altman, and Michael Cimino, were more inspired by the French New Wave and German Expressionism than Wilder and Huston. They began to bring a more European sense of free expression to their work, and we got such classics as The Godfather, Apocalypse Now, Star Wars, Jaws, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, The Last Picture Show, Paper Moon, Harold and Maude, The French Connection, The Exorcist, Mean Streets, Raging Bull, Nashville, and The Deer Hunter. The 70s was a special time in American cinema in the sense that the most popular and financially successful movies were the best movies. Just take a look at this chart of the top 10 box office films of 1972. Almost every single one of these movies is in the crop of the best movies of that year, not just financially, but artistically, and to this day remains front and center of the greatest American films of all time. And look at the top 10 of 1973. Look at how many classics dominated the box office. Contrast that with this chart of the top 10 box office films of 2021. While these movies no doubt have their fans, not a single one of them can claim to be the best of anything that year. Licorice Pizza, Red Rocket, The Card Counter, The Green Knight, Nightmare Alley, The Power of the Dog. Artistically, these are, without a doubt, some of the best films of that year, and not a single one of them was able to crack the top 30 box office films, and only one was able to crack the top 50, The Green Knight, and barely at that, as it came in 49th place. This trend is not just isolated to 2021. It is basically a rule. The best films of any given year rarely, if ever, are financially rewarded for it. Big-budget popcorn tentpole films get the most eyeballs and make the most money, because studios have the deep pockets to assure that they are shoved into the consciousness of the movie-going public. But back in the 70s, this wasn't the case. Studios were more interested in making the best film, and were wise enough to realize that with the proper marketing campaign, the best films could be the most successful financially, and not only that, have a chance of being remembered for generations. It also meant that they could have a solid catalog that they can continue to mine from in the home video market, with remasterings and special editions. Movies like Spider-Man No Way Home, Black Widow, Fast 9 really have no life outside that narrow box office window. They are sequels, one in an assembly line of many, not distinct enough to remain in anyone's consciousness, and certainly will not be remembered decades from now. No one will be clamoring for a remastered special edition of Black Widow. The point is, by studios prioritizing the best movies, like they did in the 70s, it allowed directors of these movies to have a higher public profile, William Friedkin, George Lucas, Peter Bogdanovich, Francis Ford Coppola, Bob Fosse. These directors who had movies on those lists were superstars in their own right because their films were not only financially very successful, they could boast being the best artistically as well. It was the best of both worlds for them. People forget that before Star Wars, American Graffiti made George Lucas a very rich and famous man, as that movie made $140 million in 1973, which in today's movie currency would equate to about $800 million at the box office. Nearly $1 billion, and this movie has no explosions or lightsaber battles. It was about relationships. As the studio system slowly morphed into a more streamlined and simplistic factory, more obsessed with concepts than artistic merit, and began to churn out tentpole movies that could easily be sequelized, the role of the director began to become much less relevant in that system, more of a hired journeyman than an individualistic cultural voice. As a result, the top 10 box office lists began to have more in common with the 2021 top 10 than the one from the 70s. Directors who had something to say were no longer as welcome in the studio system. They wanted guaranteed hits that relied on explosions and gunfights. So if you wanted to make an artistic statement, you were immediately financially limited, since the studios are the ones that had access to tens of millions of dollars to make a movie. Filmmakers like Spike Lee, the Coen brothers, Jim Jarmusch, Steven Soderbergh, Gus Van Sant, and Todd Haynes realized that in order to have a career making the kinds of films they wanted to make, they were going to have to get creative with finding the money. Lee's grandmother helped him with the financing of his breakout hit, She's Gotta Have It. The Coens pestered local doctors and dentists for the money to make their timeless classic Blood Simple. And for many in this new crop of artistically focused directors, film festivals were the only way to get their work recognized. But even with acclaimed festival hits, the studios still weren't interested in dealing with iconoclastic filmmakers. Regardless, these directors continued to craft films outside the studio system and make a name for themselves with audiences who were hungry for a more balanced cinema diet outside the junk food the studios were serving them, welcomed these new visionaries. But their films were still not box office hits. The thing that kept them relevant was something today's culture seems to have lost: the all-important film critic. Film critics were an important ally to talented and up-and-coming directors, championing them to studios in the 70s and giving them a leg up over the competition.
I'm Pauline Kael, and I write about movies for The New Yorker. When I write about movies, all my experience and reactions seem to come together, and there's an exhilaration for me, and I think sometimes it shows up in the prose.
But you know, movies are so integral to our lives. I mean, they can mean so much to us, and they affect us so much. But it's fascinating to write about them and try to figure out the ways in which we're responding and what they're doing to us and what they're doing to other people.
I also admire this film very much. One of the things I liked about it was the way that Schrader fairly fearlessly integrated myth and magic with everyday details of the guy cleaning out the cages at the zoo and so forth.
I just thought that the writing was smarter, and the number of characters that are being juggled in this screenplay. I mean, normally you have, you know, a row of ducks that get knocked off in these pictures, and here I got to know some of the ducks.
It's an irony that mad slasher movies like the Friday the 13th series routinely get an R rating from the MPAA and play to millions of teenagers, anyone who can find that legendary 18-year-old adult guardian to go in with them. But let an artistic film come along that really sincerely considers the subject, and it's banished by the MPAA to that ghetto between the R and the X, so that most theater chains are afraid or legally prevented from booking it.
And even when studios became less interested in all-powerful directors in the 80s and 90s, critics were still an important cultural force, because cinema was still an important art form that was culturally relevant. Back when people still read newspapers, directors got in those papers because of film critics, so the public knew who they were. Information dispersion was very simple back then. Television, newspapers, and magazines. That's how people got their information. And everything was streamlined to the point where there was generally one narrative going out to the public, not the labyrinthian maze of fractured narratives of today's social media where some supposedly famous TikToker will be completely unknown to the guy down the street, where everyone has their own little bubble of reality. In the 80s and 90s, if someone in Topeka, Kansas knew something about the culture, Someone in New York City knew the same thing, and so did someone in Seattle, Atlanta, Detroit, etc. There was one narrative, one reality, and everyone lived in the same bubble. As a result, even though Spike Lee and the Coens weren't churning out box office hits, they were still worth paying attention to because the critics said so, and the public got the message. Critics were the modern tastemakers of cinema. That's the only way Lee became the face of the Nike Michael Air Jordan commercials of the late 80s. Having starred in his own indie hit helped, but can you imagine a director today having such cultural influence as to be the face of an entire marketing campaign surrounding a brand as popular as Nike?
In my family, we think the wine you drink the most should be the best. We like Paul Masson's Burgundy. It's smooth and rich.
It just doesn't happen anymore. Directors simply do not have that kind of influence now. Lee was the Air Jordan guy. The Coens were the quirky indie guys who made movies the studios wouldn't dare make. Soderbergh was floundering in artistic no man's land until his second breakout hit, Out of Sight, which allowed him to dovetail nicely into putting his stamp on star-studded studio-approved hits like Ocean's 11, and Gus Van Sant, Todd Haynes, and John Waters were the face of queer cinema. While these new directors no doubt shaped the cinematic counterculture, there was a new crop of filmmakers ready to take the industry by storm. They included Quentin Tarantino, Paul Thomas Anderson, Darren Aronofsky, David O. Russell, Spike Jonze, Kevin Smith, Wes Anderson, and David Fincher. These filmmakers were even more so cultural mavericks, making shockingly singular visions about pornography, drugs, gangsters, serial killers, vulgar store clerks, and reclusive loners. The movie director continued to be a culturally relevant figure, someone who could channel the subconscious desires of the movie-going public, dying for stories the studios weren't interested in telling. As a result, these directors had a connection with the movie-going public as strong as any movie star. This, as mentioned before, the flow of information is a big part of it. There used to be one narrative. Everyone was on the same page. There weren't competing flows of information like in today's fractured social media landscape. So in the 90s, if the powers that be decided someone was important, everyone got the message. And that person was important to everybody. I can't tell you how many times I've randomly stumbled upon a story about some supposedly famous social media influencer with millions of followers, and I've never heard of this person. And I know I'm not the only one to experience this. Today, outside the holdovers from the pre-millennium culture, people like George Clooney, Madonna, and Tarantino, if someone becomes quote-unquote famous, they are only known to small pockets of the population and isolated from the rest, because the flow of information is fractured. Back in the day, famous meant famous. Everyone knew who they were, from Chicago to France to Bangladesh. Hell, if you were stationed somewhere in Antarctica, you would know this person. Now, there are two directors I've intentionally left out of this conversation until now, Jordan Peele and Greta Gerwig. And it's because while Peele has become the face of black cinema, and really just cool genre cinema in general, he was already famous before he started directing films, being the Peele in the duo Key and Peele. People know of Peele from his sketch comedy roots more than his filmmaking, and Gerwig has become a major director after the success of Barbie. I'd argue she was able to make a very personal artistic statement in a very corporate environment, with one of the most corporate intellectual properties imaginable. No small feat, but she's not hosting SNL. At best, she got a surprise cameo. And the conversations around Barbie have a lot more to do with Ryan Gosling's Oscar nod and the Barbenheimer phenomenon than Gerwig. She's been more caught up in the wave of Barbie fever than being the face of it. And on that note, I would say the shift from personal filmmaking to studio blockbuster filmmaking absolutely transformed the way the public views and treats cinema. It's a disposable medium now. The studios generally don't give people any reason to value cinema outside something you put on in the background as you fold laundry or forget about as soon as you hit the parking lot after seeing something at the theater. This actually started in the 80s and 90s, but critics were still relevant enough to keep the public focused on what is a crucial aspect of the medium. But with the emergence of Rotten Tomatoes, what used to be an individual critic's voice has been whittled down to a collection of anonymous critical voices put into a blender from which a number emerges. a random score that often isn't even accurate, since Rotten Tomatoes oftentimes counts a mediocre review as fresh. This binary black and white thinking is part of the new philosophy of not only studio filmmaking, where nuance is practically non-existent, as with no tastemakers around to steer the cultural conversation, a role previously held by relevant critics, the public's thinking has become more aligned with studios, and in turn, the corporate influences that govern those studios. So the modern thought process is a corporate thought process. This is about as far away from artistic integrity that the director is supposed to represent as you could possibly get. Directors no longer matter to the culture because the artistically driven free-thinking mentality they represent is no longer relevant. Corporate-controlled media is what drives culture now. Even the so-called independent media outlets are often controlled by a corporate entity, giving the illusion of free thought, but with a boardroom agenda being the priority. People often don't even realize that their thought process isn't even their own. If they trace it back, it can have its roots in some corporate spreadsheet on how to promote something they're selling, whether it be a product or an ideology. And sometimes the two are one and the same. If you enjoyed this video, consider hitting the like and subscribe button, as I'll be posting more content in the future. Thanks for watching.